some results from a report conducted by myself and two students, which include Rachel Dinger in the middle and Kelexis Moore. So let's get started. This report is called Acknowledging the Inequities, Yet Supporting Black Girls' Wellness here in the state of Tennessee. We'll specifically be talking about Black girls' experiences with school suspensions, disproportional school suspensions, adverse childhood experiences, policies and practices around that, and how to support Black girls' wellness overall. So, national suspensions. What's going on across the country? We know that K through 12 students receive 2.8 one or more out of school suspensions across the nation. That's from 2015-2016 data. Compared to their white peers, Black K through 12 students were 3.8 times more likely to receive an out of school suspension. But let's think about Black girls for a moment. While representing 8% of the enrollment, they represent also 14% of students receiving one or more out of school suspensions. And in fact, Black girls are the only group of girls across the country being disproportionately suspended. This doesn't mean specifically like in California or Texas, there aren't other groups of girls being disproportionately suspended. But in the aggregate, across the country, we know that Black girls are the only group of girls being disproportionately suspended. And for me, that raises a red flag. So let's move forward. So why Black girls? So for Black girls, disproportional school discipline starts as early as preschool and continues throughout their elementary to secondary education. Most recently, national data from 2017-2018 reflected that compared to white girls, Black girls had 4.19 times the risk of receiving an out-of-school suspension, 3.99 times the risk of an expulsion, and 3.66 times the risk of a school-based arrest. Additionally, as the only group of girls being disproportionately suspended, often for subjective infractions, again, this raises a bright red flag to me because that means there's something we can do to mitigate it. And so I'm really glad to be in working alongside organizations such as Define Design, who are invested in the work concerning Black girls and other girls of color. So again, in the era of Black Girl Magic and Black Girl Joy and hashtag Black Girls Rock, we know that Black girls are indeed more than the negative academic and schooling outcomes they experience. And so while we uplift that, we also want to acknowledge that more needs to be done in the way of school-based interventions and one-on-one interventions to address these inequitable outcomes. So again, why should we care about school suspensions, right? There's so many other things that we could care about. So some may say, well, do the crime, pay the time, right? But I'm here to offer that suspensions are not just given for misbehavior. As I mentioned, they include major outcomes for subjective infractions. And the practice has significant impacts on girls' academic, social, and behavioral outcomes. And disproportionate suspensions of Black girls are impacting their overall wellness, and this area is understudied because it has significant life course outcomes on girls. That's why we're doing this work to think about, again, how do we mitigate this and help schools to support positive psychosocial, academic, and supporting that would support the developmental needs and academic needs of girls. So what's going on here in Tennessee, right? So national data aside, what we know using data from the Office of Civil Rights is that Black girls are 4.22 times more likely to be suspended a single time and 15.09 times more likely to receive multiple suspensions. And again, this is important because they're missing class time. And so while, yes, every student should be held accountable for behavior, I'm here to remind us all that suspensions are not only meted for behavior, and sometimes they're given for subjective infractions, such as the way students wear their hair, or being out of uniform, things of that nature. So we also know that Black girls are 2.8 times more likely to be arrested, and that's compared to all other girls in Tennessee, and 8.62 times they have 8.62 times the risk of being expelled without educational supports, and 3.26 times of receiving expulsion related to zero tolerance policies. So students experiencing harsh disciplinary practices are disproportionately more likely to endure poor academic outcomes, depreciated student to teacher relationships, greater antisocial behavior, repeat future suspensions, and a greater likelihood to be engaged in the school to prison pipeline. So again, this is why we're focusing on this topic. So let's get down into it. What are some of the reasons that disproportional suspensions are happening aside from behavior? So we also know there are inequitable policies. So from research from the Let Her Learn campaign, what they unveiled was that girls had greater risk of disproportional or disciplinary actions just for sometimes protecting their bodies, and so they had disproportionate exposure, and then for defending their bodies from, for example, harassment. And so they're at increased risk for school discipline and school suspensions in particular for that type of interaction. We also know across the US, and this is research by Child Trends, that many schools just have vague language. They have vague language around school discipline practices and school discipline. There's a prevalence of vague language in school discipline policies. So, for example, a student may receive a school suspension for disruption, defiance, disobedience. Now, if I had a room of 100 people with me right now, I could ask you all, what's your definition of disruption? And we'd all have a different definition. What's a definition of disobedience? And our definitions may be a little different. And so the problem with vague disciplinary language is that our biases get in the way. And when our biases getting in the way, that's when we start to see some of these inequitable outcomes. And we posit that's part and parcel why we see some of these disproportional suspensions that are connected to Black girls. So again, we also use data from the Office of Civil Rights to talk about, what are the in-school supports or resources or school-based staff that Black girls have access to. So great news, we know that 80% of all girls attend a school where a full-time equivalent school counselor is available. That's really great. We also know that 57% of all girls attend a school where a full-time equivalent school nurse is available, right? So that's at least one or more. We know also that 42% of all girls attend a school where law enforcement officers are available. Now, having law enforcement officers in schools has become more prevalent after the Gun-Free Schools Act, right, to reduce violence in schools. However, what we also know is there has been an uptick in young people being involved with juvenile justice and being involved in the school to prison pipeline because there are now more law enforcement officers in schools. And so part of the conversation has been, do we always need law enforcement officers to help with school discipline issues if they're going to involve children into juvenile justice, the juvenile justice system, right? But what I want you to look at here is the percentages. So we also know that 12% of all girls attend a school where a full-time equivalent school psychologist is available. However, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I come from the profession of social work, only 7% of all girls attend a school where a full-time school social worker is available. What's important for us to know about this as well is that although we have over 80% of girls having access to a full-time equivalent counselor, counselors in Tennessee have a 339 students to 1 ratio. Now, there are other states that are worse, right? But that's still a lot. And so while we applaud our school counselors for the great work we're doing, we also recognize that they may not have the capacity to do some of the one-on-one work that they'd want to do. And so part of our suggestion here is we absolutely need more school social workers in our schools. We need more school psychologists who have the time for the one-on-one interventions. School social workers in particular having the opportunity to do home visiting when that's possible. So this is important data for us to consider about what it looks like for schools to better support our students and to do the one-on-one work with Black girls in this case that may be helpful to them in reducing some of these disproportionate suspensions. So as my colleagues and I have research in this realm of work, we've also been interested in girls' ACEs exposure and what relationship this has to behavior. And what we know is that childhood adversities can be associated with negative behaviors. And so that's important for the school context for us to understand that. And so with more than 2/3 of children having a traumatic experience by the age of 16, schools are rapidly utilizing trauma-informed practices. That's really important. And but we also realize that the precursors to trauma are not always neutral. And so we suggest that as trauma-informed practices are introduced, as other school-based interventions are introduced, they should also consider the role of systemic oppression, whether that's gender-based, whether that's racial, whether that's income-based, right? And what the impact is on young people, girls in particular, and how this is influencing the disparities they're experiencing within school. So I brought up trauma outcome ACEs, and that's also spoken in conjunction with trauma symptomology. And so here are some examples of what trauma symptomology might look like. And it may not be true for every student, but what is clear is that educators untrained in childhood responses to adversity are likely to stigmatize students who are experiencing ACEs. And so what this means is that they could be disciplining trauma. And so therefore, there's a need to do a deep dive into what it looks like to support young people who are experiencing childhood adversities and being cognizant and understanding that background before meting some discipline outcome. Likewise, we say it's important to understand the role of childhood adversities and how its relationship to current policies and lawsuits. So we know that we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, which affirms and supports the need to have trauma-informed training for educators within schools. And thankfully, Tennessee is amongst a handful of states that has passed legislation that says that all school staff must be trained in trauma and adverse childhood experiences, so that they should strive to become trauma-informed schools. But we know that there's also legal precedents for this work. And in the case of Peter P. et al. Versus Compton, defendants were alleged to have subjected trauma-impacted students to punitive and counterproductive suspensions and expulsions and referral to law enforcement. So this is huge. This lawsuit, right? The defendants are suing the school district for not being supportive of young people who are disproportionately exposed to ACEs, to trauma, right? And there are inadvertent effects on how these kids are showing up in schools, how they're experiencing school discipline and their academic outcomes. So this is a cry out to say, young people need support, right? The traditional models of school discipline can't continue to be our go-to when we know there's so much that could be going on in the lives of the young people that schools serve. So Tennessee specific, what's going on with Black girls as it relates to ACEs? Out of the 9 adverse childhood experiences I have listed here, Black girls have a greater risk for each and every one of them, except for parental mental health difficulty and parent drug use. This doesn't mean that there aren't parent mental health difficulties and parent drug use in Black communities, but what it does mean is that Black girls are not overrepresented or don't have a greater risk in these areas, but they have a greater risk in the 7 of the other areas. So neighborhood violence, death of a parent, incarcerated parent, domestic violence, divorce of parents, racial or ethnic discrimination, making the basic needs difficult. Imagine showing up to school every day and having some of these ACEs exposure in your life, in your community, in your household, and expected to come to class and just learn like everyone else, right? And so again, it's commendable that states like the state of Tennessee are striving towards training all educators and staff to become trauma informed and creating trauma informed school spaces. And I use this information to say, are those trauma informed interventions intersectional? How are they responsive to race? How are they responsive to culture? How are they responsive to history, right? To gender. And I really appreciate the work of Defined Design centering the need to be gender responsive and to be culturally responsive. And that is a call that needs to be made to our schools as well. And so this describes some of the same thing. You'll see this in the final report that gives a little description of each ACE and what the implications of that is for practice. Finally, it's important also to talk about protective factors. We can talk about the risks, but how do we protect young people? And so we know some of the protective factors from the literature are that young girls need nurturing environments where they can feel attached to the adults that are in there, right? There needs to be knowledge of parenting and child development, right? And so we know that there's no rule book for how to raise a child. But in the context of COVID-19, right, in the context of children experiencing adversities, there are particular steps that may need to be taken, right? Additional training so that a parent and adults can better support Black girls. This is not to say that all Black girls have experienced trauma. I want to make sure you understand that. But in the context of young Black girls who are experiencing adversities, how can we create a more protective environment for them? Some of that looks like the parents in their lives getting trauma-informed training. And just as parents demonstrate resilience, being able to model that for their daughters. This doesn't mean they have to be strong all the time, but to just demonstrate what emotional range looks like. And again, we have examples of social connections, right? Social connections connected to social support, community. Community is always important, whether it's grandma or auntie or your parent or siblings or a trusted neighbor or friend, right? Girls need to have community that they can be locked into where they know that they can be safe. And that is a protective factor. So when the report is released, that's content that will be made available to all who would like to read more. But again, there's more that can be done even at the policy level. We know, for example, that in Massachusetts, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley put forward the push-out policy. And that policy was created to end unfair, punitive school-based harm, right? That's punitive discipline practices that are unresponsive to trauma. And so other states are catching on to this. So it's important that we're there too, right? We understand that the research is there and we need to follow it up, not only with school-based practices and policies, but statewide policies and practices, and even federal. And I was really excited when I learned that in the city of Pittsburgh, that the organization Gwen's Girls was honored in their work to support Black girls and was given, through their efforts, the Black Girls Equity Month. Imagine what that would look like here in Tennessee or in Nashville, where we make a deliberate attempt to say, we recognize there's an issue. We recognize that girls are being disproportionately suspended. We recognize their involvement with juvenile justice or their overall involvement with child welfare or et cetera, et cetera. And not only do we recognize it, but we're going to create space and time to do something about it. And I just thought that was powerful. That is connecting now power to practice. And so it would be great to make something like that happen locally as well. And in terms of advocacy, other groups, you've heard of hashtag Black Girls Rock, Black Girl Magic. There have been campaigns to shape the narrative of what we know about Black girls, right? That Black girls are not only aces, they're not only school suspensions. There's so much more that's going on with the Black girls in our lives and the Black girls that we're educating, right? And that part of what this wellness process could look like. For example, these scholars have utilized the concept of racial microaffirmations, and which are subtle verbal and nonverbal strategies people of color consciously engage with other people of color to affirm each other's value, integrity, and shared humanity. Now, as you read that definition, you may realize, oh, I always do this. But it's good to put a word to the practice. So we may say hashtag Black Girl Magic and Black Girls Rock, but now you know specifically that this is a type of racial affirmation. And I hold that this is something that girls need, that they can co-create together, and that the adults in their lives can offer to them, right? As a type of affirmation. Again, in the context of systems where girls may be marginalized because of their gender, because of their race, because of their income, maybe because of their educational needs, etc., it is important that we make extra effort to affirm them, and affirm them not only like good job, but in the essence of their being, that they're affirmed as a Black girl. So in this report, we've also pulled together recommendations for both parents and practitioners about healing and avoiding adultification and utilizing affirmation and what we call joy incubation, right? That in this world we live in, there are highs and lows, right? And when there are lows for our girls, that you can incubate joy for them. This is not to say to avoid and to ignore hard times, but again, to recognize that they don't have to stay there and that joy is also always available to them. So we stand on that parents, school social workers, practitioners, educators can be incubators for joy for young Black girls. And part of the way we lead with that is leading with them, understanding their voice, centering their meaning making, so we know what brings them joy. So we know what brings them pain, and so that we can mitigate those factors. And finally, it looks like co-advocating with girls. And to co-advocate, that means that we are ensuring that Black girls have the power, all right, are getting the opportunity to acquire power, to express themselves, whether that's through music, whether that's dance, whether that's through debate, right? But to be co-creators of space in schools, to be co-creators of their future forward. Again, the report will include a resource list of books that educators and adults and practitioners can be reading as it pertains to uplifting Black girls, work that's been done already by other organizations pertaining to Black girls and why this is important, right? Why Black girls as a group need individualized and specific attention. The report will also describe strengths and resilience using data from the National Survey of Children's Health. We show that nearly 70% of all Black girls always or mostly feel like they stay calm, and this is reported out by parents. 94% of Black girls in the sample always or mostly show curiosity and interest. 90% of Black girls in this sample always and mostly work to finish tasks started. I think this is good data because it gives us something to work with. Again, remembering that if we only think of Black girls in terms of ACEs, then we don't know them at all, right? And that we know, if we know that they're showing interest and curiosity, you find out what that interest and curiosity is and invest in it and allow them to be creators of that space as well. And if we know that they're working to finish tasks started, then that means that they're interested in work and in school, right? And so when we see academic disparities, it doesn't always speak to their inability or lack of interest in school, but there may be other things going on. And this is where the adults in their lives, the educators, the school social workers, the parents, help to mitigate some of those factors. So the overall focus of this report is about promoting wellness. We believe in highlighting the excellence and brilliance of Black girls, uplifting their voice and their ability as critical thinkers, affirming their aesthetic expression, appreciating their cultural diversity. It's important to model emotional regulation, normalize emotional range. Oftentimes, Black women and girls get stereotyped as the angry Black women, but it's okay, right? Everyone gets to have a range of emotions. And that's what we say here, is to normalize emotional range and also contextualize those emotions versus demonizing them. And again, not penalizing their pain, but instead uplifting their creativity and their joy, right? Incubating that joy, cultivating their leadership, appreciating their history and future, and providing supportive accountability over punishment. The data that we used showed that despite high risk for ACEs, Black girls in Tennessee are still rated as mostly always affectionate and bouncing back and smiling and laughing according to their parents. So let's not wait till those smiles are gone for us to notice that we need to support Black girls. Again, the report will display some definitions of what is Black girl wellness. How do we create the space and co-construct that definition with Black girls? Here we talk about it including unity, right? That's a community aspect. Self-determination, right? Uplifting Black girls' self-determination. Their collective work and responsibilities. Purpose, creativity. And finally, we end here. This is written by my co-author, Kealexis Moore, graduate student in the College of Social Work. And I asked her, if you could write a letter to Black girls, what would it say? And here's what she says. There's no one way to be a Black girl. Who you are may change from day to day, week to week, year to year. But no matter where you are on your journey, you can always take pride in being a Black girl. We are a community who always protects and welcomes you no matter our differences. Do not let the world convince you that you're anything less than worthy and deserving of safety, softness, and respect. Being a Black girl is not a deficit, but an honor. It means you are never alone. And if you feel like you are, all you must do is reach out and feel the generations of sisterhood surrounding you. It will not always be easy to be a Black girl, but it will always be worth it. So we challenge you, to those who support Black girls, what would your affirming letter to Black girls look like? What would it say? We suggest write a letter to a young Black girl that you want to encourage today. Thank you.